but I think we should start so that we give enough time and opportunity for our speaker, Dr. Aishah, today to share her expertise with us. Good afternoon again, and welcome back to SieQA 2011. Hope everyone had a good lunch break and are good to start this afternoon session. Allow me to introduce myself again. I'm Isa, your moderator for today. We had a very good session this morning, and we will continue the theme of efficient and effective delivery system with integrity with our second and last topic of the day on alternative assessment, which will be delivered by Associate Professor TS Dr. Aishah Abu Bakar from University of Malaysia, Pahang. We're very happy to have her. Welcome, Dr. Aishah. A little bit of an introduction about Dr. Aishah before we have the pleasure of listening to her. So Associate Professor TS Dr. Aishah Abu Bakar is the Director at the Center of Instructional Resources and E-Learning. And she also holds a post at the Academic and International Affairs Department at the University of Malaysia, Pahang. In her years of as an academic in higher education, she has received numerous awards and recognition for her outstanding contribution, including the National Teaching Award for the Engineering Cluster in the first ever National Teaching Award, National Academic Award in 2016, which was awarded by the Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia. And she is also a recipient of the Chancellor Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2007 by University Malaya. And she had served twice at the Department of Higher Education for the Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia as the Director of Academic Development Management Division, where she played a major role in driving the ministry's main policies and initiatives for the Malaysian Higher Education Blueprint 2015-2025. So she is a very experienced individual with regards to academic development. And she is well recognized for her research on assessment in higher education, specifically on e-assessment in tertiary learning, which had received several awards nationally and internationally. So with that brief introduction of Dr. Aishah, I would like to welcome her to present us the topic on alternative assessment. Please, Dr. Aishah.
Thank you, Ms. Isa. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Perfect.
Thank you. That was such a long introduction. Well, I'm here to share whatever that I practice and whatever that I know with you. I'm not really an expert in alternative assessment, but I have practiced to a certain extent alternative assessment, and this afternoon we will have a look at how we can actually practice alternative assessment in a meaningful and in more efficient way, hopefully. Allow me to share my screen now. Okay. Can you see my screen? Right, okay. I have prepared the PowerPoint slide with the QR code available for you to scan now. Because I think I'm aware that when we present it over Zoom or over whatever teleconferencing platform, sometimes you cannot see those small fonts, and perhaps some of the graphics can get a little bit blur. So I would like to give 1 or 2 minutes for all participants to scan the QR code, and from there you should be able to get this PowerPoint slide, and you can refer to the PowerPoint slides on your phone or whatever devices that you have, so that you can see it clearly. Right. Let me know if you fail to do so. I hope you can get the material. Okay. If everybody is ready, maybe the Secretariat may help me scan the QR code and later put the link for others who will be able to join us later to be able to get the material as well. Thank you.
Yes, we'll do that, Dr. Aishah.
Yeah, sure. Are we done? Right, if we're done, let's try and have a look at this Mentimeter. It would be nice to have a small break at the middle, but I think I decided to put a little bit of question to you, to all participants, on why do I choose or use alternative assessment. I do hope that you can participate. If you can go to Mentimeter, I'm sure you all have it in your handphone, these apps, and you can put in the code there. And perhaps we can have a rough idea. Why do you choose or use alternative assessment? Let me have a look at the actual data. So one of you has said that I choose alternative assessment because it's more convenient to assess skill, real life skill. It's flexible due to flexibility. For those who just coming in, the code is 95939478. It's the word cloud. Let's have a look. Flexible, convenient. Plan B for contingency to assess real life. Great. To adapt to online teaching and learning, more reflective, hopefully. To assess real life skill. To engage and encourage in-depth learning. More coming in. 15. To assess students, to adapt to online learning because it's exciting. Got a lot of people said that you choose alternative assessment because it's flexible. Obviously, when we talk about flexible, perhaps you referring to we have more choice and you can create one on your own. To cater to specific needs, yes. Effective, yes, definitely. Alternative assessment is one of the most effective assessment methods that you can choose from. Any more? Exciting, flexible and easy. Authentic learning, yes. Complexity of learning, yes. Anyone would like to participate, or shall we just stop here? There are 19. At least now we are having 113 participants. It would be nice to have a lot of people to have a say. More coming in. To adapt, to assess. Convenient, flexible seems to be the main theme here. Right. Okay. Right. We can come back to this later on. Engaging, convenient, engaging, convenient. Right. Perhaps what we're going to do now is we can come back to that later. But the reason why I would like to start with that is to find out. There are two reasons why we went through that Mentimeter. One is to find out whether we are in this room now talking about alternative assessment, how we're going to do it, how we're going to design it, and how we're going to assess it, as what I've mentioned in, I don't know whether Sunway managed to put up my advertisement or not, but those are the things that I promised in the advertisement that I will address this afternoon within these 2 hours. I hope that we will have enough time for that. one of the things that I mentioned in that advertisement is that are we doing alternative assessment because we have been given the chance to move away from the final exam as what has been illustrated here, or we actually choose alternative assessment because we believe in alternative assessment, because we choose alternative assessment because it's convenient, because it's flexible, because it can measure in-depth knowledge, and all the things that you mentioned in those Mentimeter. I would like to begin by us being honest about ourselves when we choose alternative assessment. If we are the person, or if we have been instructed to move away from final exam and having to choose alternative assessment, we also have the same question to ourselves. Why do we move from final exam to alternative assessment in the first place? Is it because it is directive? Is it because it's our own choice because of this pandemic, the fact that we have to run our practice, our teaching and learning from the physical in-person face-to-face to remote online learning? I just like to share with you one anecdote. This is not an anecdote so much. It is about what I went through from the recent webinar. And the thing about that webinar is it's about how can we reduce cheating in an online exam. I personally have tried several strategies on how to cope with examination during the pandemic session. And until today, I think the question is how can we move away from exam, and how can we actually reduce, if we have to use final exam as one of our assessment method for our course, how can we ensure that students are not cheating and we can preserve integrity in an online exam? And in one of these webinar, when talking about having to deal with cheating in an online exam, a point has been raised about the two types of assessment. When I talk about two types of assessment, is one is examination and one is actually alternative assessment. So the point that has been raised here is that the speaker said that to a certain extent, when we use examination, when we talk about having to make sure that our question is authentic, having to make sure that we use proctoring devices, having to make sure that students will not cheat in examination, we actually start our assessment with the premise of mistrust. To a certain extent, we judge that our students will cheat to a certain extent. So we have been given actually a point there to think about when we choose whether we want to use alternative assessment or whether we want to use examination, be it mid-semester exam or be it final exam. What is the premise of our assessment that we choose? If we choose alternative assessment, for example, are we to a certain extent saying that we start choosing the assessment method based on we actually trust our student to be able to do that task that we're going to give to students in alternative assessment? Because alternative assessment is about giving student tasks that we know student able to carry out that task from day one until they finish. So when we're talking about tasks, we are talking about processes, right? So to a certain extent, when I listen to that webinar, I'm beginning to think about, oh, that's a good point, because most of the time, the reason why I personally love alternative assessment in comparison to examination is because for me, alternative assessment is not judgmental in the first place. It allows me and my student to develop trust. where I trust my students to be able to grow. When I mention about able to grow, I'm talking about they able to grow their knowledge, they able to grow their communication skill, they able to grow their soft skill and also their practical skills. So when we are talking about the 3 domains, here we are talking about when I personally choose alternative assessment, I am aware that I am there to help students to develop all these 3 domains, learning domains, using alternative assessment method. Therefore, that shows that alternative assessment begins with the premise that we trust our student. I'm not saying that if we are the lecturer who choose final exam, we do not trust our student. But all I'm saying is that there is a truth in the argument that when you use alternative assessment to a certain extent, you begin with a premise of trust. And because you trust that learning can be done by your student, you know that learning can be developed by your student, not necessarily by you. Therefore, you would like or you would prefer to use alternative assessment in contrast to choosing examination where it is to a certain extent judgmental, with no feedback, with no room for students to develop their domains, their learning domains over time. Because when we talk about exam, we are talking about putting them in a room, be it in a cyber room or be it in a physical room, on a particular time in an observed condition, and normally they are only allowed to perform, or we are trying to measure performance of an individual. Unlike alternative assessment, I think if you reflect what we normally give students on alternative assessment, we give students time, we give them chance to grow. We believe that they can grow over time with our helps and with our feedback throughout the learning process. So that is what I would like to begin with this webinar, to allow us to do a little bit of reflection, okay, on why do we choose or why do we use alternative assessment. Is it for learning development? Is it to judge? Is it to fit our convenience? Is it because of the feature that we love? But I personally have, I think, a very concrete basis on why I choose alternative assessment. And later on, I would like to share with you what are the features of alternative assessment that I believe have the ability to help students to grow. And secondly, we do hope that from this session as well, apart from the reflection that we have done early on, we will be able to look at how do we design an effective alternative assessment using performance tasks, design variables. I would like to introduce you to this, and also basic feature of constructive alignment. And finally, we do hope we have enough time to allow you to see how you can perform alternative assessment using formative and also summative assessment approaches in the physical and also in an online environment. Is it okay? Right. I do hope that Ms. Iza will stop me from time to time. If there's any question from the chat box, you can just stop me, Puan Iza. And also, I do hope that unmute your mic at any time. Please stop me or interrupt me because I won't be able to see several screens here. All that I can see is my screen.
No worries, Dr. Aishah. We'll alert you if there's any questions coming in.
All right, thank you so much. Okay then, to be honest, when I was given this topic, I I'm not sure where to start because honestly, I think those who's going to join, in fact, those who are ever in this room now must have had a background on alternative assessment, because there has been plenty of references, be it locally or internationally, plenty of webinar out there on YouTube, and a lot of resources available for us to refer to. And these are some of the webinar that has been conducted last year, and also books from the university, like University of Malaya. I'm sure your university has come up with a guidebook as well. And there are also guidebooks from the Ministry of Higher Education, which has been launched, I think, in 2018 as well on this. So this is not something new, and this is not something that you are not familiar with. So today, as I mentioned, you may ask me some questions if you prefer, and I will help you from time to time. So what I would like to do now is I would like to share with you a little bit of excerpt from some of these references, and it is only fair to do a little bit of revision on the types of assessment, because alternative assessment is only one of them. So if we look at the reason why I take an excerpt from the UPM book here is because most of the time the term formative and also summative assessment being, to a certain extent, being confused. And in here we can see that there are two common types of assessment that we normally been told about. That is formative assessment and also summative assessment. But the thing that I like about what has been explained from the UPM book is that it says here that formative assessment does not come with grade. And in fact, this is something that I have been telling lecturers from time to time in my training programs, that formative assessment is not an assessment activity. It's not an activity that you give to your students for you to grade, for you to evaluate. So when we give grades, meaning that we evaluate students. So the purpose is not for evaluation, but the purpose is actually to assess and to find out where your learner is in comparison to your intended learning outcome. If, for example, your learner is quite far away from the intended learning outcome, as a teacher, we need to fit or come up with the strategies on how to help our student to be moving closer to the intended learning outcome. Whereas if you look at the summative assessment, this is the term that we commonly confused. When we talk about summative assessment, we are talking about an activity that we give to our students, okay, where we give grades to a certain extent. It is also called evaluation, right? Therefore, when we talk about midterm exam, when we talk about coursework, when we talk about assignment that we give students assignment throughout the 14 weeks of our semester. And those are indeed, although we call it continuous assessment, there are indeed summative assessment. And the reason why we call it summative assessment is because if we look at the position of summative, and in here you can see that assignment 1, midterm exam, and assignment 2, they are all what we call, some university call it coursework, some university call it continuous assessment, but these are what we call summative. Actually, a final exam is also summative. The reason why we call it summative is because when you sum up these two, all these assessments together, you will get 100% from the student course mark. And that is why a book written by Sue Bloxham, one of the good book on assessment in higher education, that I refer to, actually term this coursework or continuous assessment as multi-point summative, because it is indeed a summative assessment. But that is not our main discussion today. All I'm saying is that when we conduct our continuous assessment, because majority of us are actually using this term. For the, perhaps some of us are using a weightage of 60-40, 60% continuous assessment and 40% final exam. Okay, and out of that 60%, we normally divide it into, for example, three assessment items. And we then divide that weightage further. For example, assignment 1 is actually 10%, midterm 20, and assignment 2 is actually, for example, 10, 20, 30. Assignment 2 is 30%. So when we sum up, we're going to get 100%. So here, what we would like to explore further is, if, for example, we divide our continuous assessment in that manner, right? You can see there, normally in our document, we very seldom write a specific assessment method there. We either put assignment 1 and then assignment 2, or coursework 1 and coursework 2 there. We very rarely put there case-based 1, case-based 2, and so on and so on, because using a generic term will make it will allow freedom for other lecturers when they come in and teach that particular course to change whatever assignment it is supposed to be conducted in that particular course. So here, what I would like to demonstrate in this slide is that where is our alternative assessment. If we look at assignment 1 and assignment 2 in this example, we can actually say that we can use alternative assessment in assignment 1 and also assignment 2, right? Whereas these two are exams that I mentioned earlier on. So let's now look at how do we design assignment 1 and also assignment 2 using alternative assessment principle. So before we talk about designing our assignment 1 and 2 using alternative assessment principle, let's explore what alternative assessment is all about. These slides that I'm sharing with you is actually taken from the book produced by the Ministry of Higher Education. And we can see that there is a definition of alternative assessment. What I'm trying to highlight here is that if we look at what alternative assessment is all about, it says, it's always mentioned about we are trying to measure students' ability and proficiency in performing. So when we talk about performing, meaning that we give something for a student to do, okay? And what is it that we want students to perform? We would like students to perform task, be it a complex task or be a simple task, depending on the time frame that we have. And the task obviously related, to intended learning outcome. And also, what it mentioned in this book is that alternative assessment, it differ from the traditional standardized testing. The traditional standardized testing is the typical exam type. So when we talk about exam type, we are talking about midterm exam, test, quiz. Those are the standardized testing. But alternative assessment are not test, quiz, midterm exam, and also final exam. Here we are talking about giving student an activity where it is process oriented. I think this is the one that I would like to stress again and again in this particular session. It is a process-oriented type of assessment, and I do hope that we take note that the fact that it is a process-oriented type of assessment, therefore we have to have the skill on how to help students to develop over that process, and we have to have the skill on how to assess process rather than how to assess the end product. So this is also something that I would like to discuss in this webinar. So you can see that there's also an example of the kind of product of alternative assessment that we expect from students, including portfolio. You can see, although portfolio is the end product of the alternative assessment, however, we can also actually use the portfolio to assess the process of the task that we give students to perform. And you can see there are other types of examples that that we can get students to do for the alternative assessment, including project works, problem-based, role play, and so on and so on. This is another illustration of alternative assessment, and this is actually from Prof. Fauzia Abdul Rahim from UUM. And you can see there several elements of alternative assessment. I have actually put those elements in the box. Those in the box are the main elements of alternative assessment. There are 4 of them altogether that I put there. One is alternative assessment is authentic in nature. We will go through how can we design our alternative assessment or assignment 1, assignment 2 authentic in nature, using performance task variable that I will introduce to you. And how is it that we can get students to perform? Okay, so basically the assessment is on is indeed performance based. How can we come up with an open-ended instructions or questions, and how can we make it a higher order thinking? So those are the main elements of alternative assessment, which I'm sure you are very familiar with. This is again another book from UPM. You can see there again and again, you can now, I think, spot the main elements that has been mentioned in all references. When we talk about alternative assessment, we are using real world situation or simulation. We have to make sure that the assessment criteria are made known to students. We're talking about making rubrics and also marking schemes available. And not only making them available, we have to make sure that we need to support students to be able to achieve them when we design our alternative assessment in the first place, which I'm going to show you later on. And how, again, how can we focus on process apart from having to measure the product. I will elaborate this even further. And how can we get students to problem solve and also exercising their higher order thinking skills. So if you look at alternative assessment, as many of you mentioned just now, you mentioned in the Mentimeter that I choose or I use alternative assessment because it helped my students to develop deep learning because it's flexible, the fact that it is process oriented and all that. So you're very right indeed. Okay. So if that is the main feature of alternative assessment that you have heard many times from references and from other webinars, so let's really now have a look at how we're going to do it. I'm not saying that this is the only way how you can design your alternative assessment tasks. There are so many approaches and ways on how you do things, but I found that some of these techniques are very effective, and I have been using it without realizing it, okay, for quite some times. So I came across this book last year during the pandemic, and it was shared by my mentor, Prof. Raja Mazna, who is now in SKU Oman. And I actually listened to the webinar, and this book was launched last year in March. It was meant for school teacher to design authentic performance tasks and projects. However, when I reflect on the idea of how to design authentic performance tasks and project to what I have practiced before, I found that there's plenty of similarity And I found that what they have discussed in that webinar, you can actually go to that particular URL and you can register and you can listen to the 1 hour webinar and you can get a certificate by listening to that webinar actually, which is going to be much clearer. So I found that the 12 design variables that they introduce in this book are highly applicable to us if we would like to design alternative assessment. So let's explore what are the 12 design variables and how we're going to use it. By the way, I'm not trying to promote this book. I'm not from ASCD. I'm not an agent or whatsoever. All I'm saying is that I came across this and I found it very useful. I have used it several times, and that is all to it, right? So let's have a look at what are the 12 variables that they have introduced in that book, and why is it that I personally would like to share this with you, and how does it work for me in my alternative assessment. So if you look at the 12 variables, they are the time frame, integration of subject, cognitive demand or rigor, level of inquiry, degree of authenticity, audiences for student products / performances, performance mode, direction, students' choice, access to resources, degree of scaffolding, evaluation of students' products / performances. I personally have used these variables. I don't use all of these variables in fact, when I have to design my exam question to make sure that my exam question is authentic so that students will not copy each other, I have actually experimented some of these variables and I use it to design my exam question, and it worked. None of my students actually able to copy each other's answers, but that is not today's session. So today's session is how can we design our alternative assessment, let's say our assignment 1 just now, using some of these variables. So let's begin. So if you look at the first variable is time frame. So how can we use this first variable as a starting point when we want to design our alternative assessment? And let's say, as I shown you earlier on, one of the assessment in my subject is assignment 1. So when I take over that subject, I then ask myself, what should I give to my student? How long should it be? How difficult should it be? How do I know whether the assignment that I'm going to give to my students is appropriate or inappropriate? So if you look at the technique as introduced in the book, you can see that the first thing that we need to think of when we want to design an alternative assessment, if we use alternative assessment, is how long will the student have to work on the task that you would like to give them, okay? And for this one, what happened is that when I look at my assignment 1, and if you look at this is our document, an excerpt from our document, the first thing that I have to check is assignment 1 is actually at what percentage. We are talking about the weightage of the assessment to the overall course mark. So here I found that assignment 1 is only 10%. And I also need to check whether, this is the old document. This is supposed to be here on course learning outcome number 1. So we can see here that this assignment was supposed to be measured in course outcome number 1, and it's only 10%. So when I want to decide how long should students spend on this particular alternative assessment or on assignment 1, first of all, I need to check on the weightage. So how do I use the information on the weightage? You can see there, not only that I have to make sure that I have to design assignment 1 so that it is constructively aligned to the learning outcome, I also have to make sure that the time that the student will spend on that particular alternative assessment will actually reflect the 10% marks that they're going to be awarded at the end of the assessment. So in here, because it is 10% from a 3 credit hours course, so if it's 3 credit hours course, we're talking about 120 student learning time, 120 hours student learning time. Therefore, 10% from 120 is actually 12 student learning time. So how do I design a task that will take up students 12 hours? So when I look at my teaching plan, I realized that assignment number 1, since it is only 12 hours, I cannot actually expect them to use many topics from my subject, because there are, for example, 10 topics from my subject. And because this is the first assignment that they have to perform, therefore it must be related to the topic very early in the subject. So I decided that this assignment, which is going to be in an alternative assessment form, will only cover topic number 1. So if I can share with you my, oops, let me see if I can share with you the SLT for my subject. You can see there that this is topic number 1, that student will have to perform their assignment, and you can see that the SLT for topic number 1 is indeed 8 hours altogether. Where the 8 hours coming from, it is actually from week 1 lecture. Okay, so for week 1, I have 2 hours lecture plus 1 hour activity. Therefore, the total student learning time is actually 8 hours, and the calculation has been shown there. And hence, the amount of time that I anticipate student will spend to really conduct their assessment is around 4 hours for student learning time, right? So total of 8 and also 4 will give me the 12 SLT for the 10% over there. So now that I'm clear, how long will this alternative assessment be, and which topic that will help students to perform this particular task, I'm now ready to design my alternative assessment. So what I'm showing you now is what I have in mind when I try to design my student assignment number 1. Right, so this is the design framework that I use, although it was not in a picture like this before, but I put them in a picture so that you can see what the framework is all about. So when I look at the time frame, the time frame is actually determined by the weightage of the course mark, okay. And because it is 10% and it is only 12 student learning time, so I give student roughly around 2 to 3 weeks to get it done. So because I only give student 2 to 3 weeks, I decided to give students a very simple case-based kind of activities for them to perform. So in this case, what I did was I decided to give students a choice actually to choose their own case. And when students choose their own case, how do I support my students? I actually provide them 3 hours lecture plus 1 hour activities on the topic that they need to perform the task that I've given to my student over here. I also, within that 2 to 3 weeks, I also give them a feedback session where I check whether what they have done is correct or incorrect, to tell them whether if they submit their report as their final product, whether they're going to score or whether they're not going to score. And also I decided when I designed this particular alternative assignment, I decided that if I give the task to individual student, I don't think they're going to finish it over 12 hours of student learning time. Because this is their first technical subject in geotechnic, because I'm teaching geotechnic. Therefore, I prefer them to work collaboratively in a group of 4. Therefore, I also use collaborative learning approach to help students to be able to perform this task. So they won't be having a fear having to perform this task. So they can feel secure and meaning that if we put them in a group, they are doing this assessment, alternative assessment, in a non-threatening environment. So that's roughly what I have in mind when I design that particular alternative assessment for my assignment number 1, right? So you can see here that I also put in this design framework several points for us to think about. One is about, if you look at the alternative assessment feature that I mentioned earlier on, alternative assessment differ from the exam or from the traditional standardized assessment in the form of it is indeed assessing process. So when we talk about assessing process, you can see that what we mean by assessing process is that when we give students tasks to do, right, we cannot be expecting them to have the ability to do it to our expectation, right? It is cruel to have that expectation. We have to, as what we have seen in the ZPD theory, the underpinning theory of using, to a certain extent, using alternative assessment, is to help students to develop their ability. So in here, what we can see there, how do we assess process is that because we know that students will struggle to develop their ability to write report, their ability to link subject content that we have delivered in the class to the case that they have chose. Therefore, we have to help them and we have to actually support them in linking content to real application or to the case. We have to support them in creating meaning in what they do. We also have to support them to familiarize themselves with collaborative learning that they are in, to help them to develop their teamwork and help them in their critical thinking as well. So we can see that all the outer circle of this framework, they are all to a certain extent the support that we need to think of when we choose alternative assessment as the assessment that we want to use in our course. So we cannot simply choose alternative assessment just because we like it, just because it's easy. We just throw it to students so that they work on their own for over 10 weeks. Or we feel that it is much easier because we do not have to find a big enough exam hall or proctoring tools that we need to work on if we have to do it via exam. But if we look at alternative assessment, to be honest, there are also arguments that quite a number of people go for final exam or exam type of assessment in comparison to alternative assessment, because exam is much easier because it is a one-off thing. But alternative assessment, if we look at the actual framework of it, not only you have to design it, you have to be ready to do it effectively and to spend a little bit more time to support your student if you choose an alternative assessment as one of your assessment methods. So when we talk about assessing product, obviously, when we give our student tasks to do, we give student grades. So we give student grades based on the product. So in here, because it is only 10%, I do not give student marks on the process. I decided to give student marks only on the product. And the product that I asked students to submit is actually their group report that account for 10% from the case that they have studied. So how do I assess process? I assess process, as I mentioned again, from the feedback and also from the lecture and also activity, but they do not actually account for any mark on the assessing process. So they are only formative assessment in nature. Students do not get any marks for that. So that is roughly about how do we take care of our first step in designing alternative assessment, just by getting an idea about the time frame and how do we actually get on from that point. So now I would like to share with you, I mentioned earlier on, when we choose alternative assessment, that does not mean that we can run away from coming up with an effective assessment instruction. When I talk about assessment instruction, I'm talking about if it's examination, we are talking about exam question. And I think we are all aware when it comes to exam question, we are very particular about preparing exam question. And in fact, we have a vetting system carefully crafted for exam. However, when it comes to assignment, when it comes to continuous assessment, some institution, I'm not saying all, but some institution or perhaps some of us are quite relaxed in paying attention to how do we prepare the questions, or the right term to use it as how do we prepare the assessment instruction. Okay, so actually how careful we need to prepare our assessment instruction, be it exam or be it alternative assessment, is actually the same. We still need to pay great attention. And in fact, if we choose alternative assessment, we have to prepare the assessment instruction carefully. And I would like to introduce you with a very basic format that you can adopt or you can adapt from here. And the one that I use here is the one also that I've learned from Singapore when I went through the CDIO workshop for 10 days. And these are the basic features of alternative assessment instruction. So you can see there, the first thing for all assessment, in order for us to make sure that our assessment is valid in the first place, we have to be very conscious that we need to design the assessment so that it aligns with the learning outcome. So in here, that is also the reason why the first part of the assessment instruction that I put here is the learning outcome, so that it reminds me and my student that this assessment is to measure what outcome. And I also put there the taxonomy level plus the weightage for this assessment, so that students are aware that I should not spend so much time on this particular assessment because it's only 10% and it's only for cognitive level 2, right? And then I have an area in my assessment instruction where I put the objective of the task that I would like them to perform. And in here, I mentioned that, in this particular assessment, I would like them to do this, and I would like them to at the end of the day to perform what particular task. Okay, so that is roughly an overview or description of the task that you would like to give to your students, right? And then the third part of the assessment instruction, okay, so this is the most important part, is about, you can change the title if you like, is about the scope of the task, or you can change it into how should you perform this task, which is much more relevant, I think, to students, right? Rather than scope of the task, maybe they think, what is it about the scope of the task? Or you can put it, how can you perform? This task. You can make it friendly to your students, right? So this is where actually you put in the instruction step by step as if you're talking to them in the classroom. Normally, if you get students to perform a task, be it in one of the coursework or your assignment, you normally give them a brief in the classroom. So whatever brief that you give in the classroom, I highly recommend you to document it this way. The reason being, we had experience, for example, in one of the MPU course, community engagement course, one of the case, this is a true case from one of the Highland institution. A student performed this task outside the university premise, outside the states, and students actually involved in an accident. It was quite a serious accident, right? And the lecturer, when scared on what has happened to the students. So the lecturer actually asked one of the coordinator, am I responsible because I have given student the task to perform, and this student ran into an accident. And my colleague at that time said that check on your assessment instruction. And true enough, when the lecturer checked on his assessment instruction, he was safe, he was covered, that he never mentioned that the student need to perform this task outside the university premise or outside the state. And in fact, the instruction task has specifically mentioned that the student should just able to perform the task within the premise that the students are in. So you see here the scope of the task, or how can student perform this task instruction is very, very important indeed. So here, how you should write it. First thing is that you should ask the student to do what they're supposed to do. For example, you can see from my previous slide, I actually show the framework, and in that framework, I mentioned to you that I decided to get students to work collaboratively, meaning that they have to work in group. So the first thing that I ask students to do is form a group. How many in a group? 4 students in a group. So I simply have to mention that because that is what I have designed for my alternative assessment in the first place, right? And then other things that you have to mention in this part of your assessment instruction is highly related to where the marks are. Okay, and if you look at this particular page, you can see the one that I have put in a group, and I bracket them. They are high. That instruction has been written and has been stated there consciously to make sure students are aware that they have to do that in order for them to get those marks. So if you give marks, for example, to how students have to describe, in this case, to describe the rock formation, because this is actually the main part of the learning outcome. Therefore, I have to get students to be able to do that. And that need to be mentioned in the instruction of the assessment. So you can see that if, for example, students have to review, you give marks on students' ability to review certain parts of your subject content. If there are marks given there, you have to actually include that in your assessment instruction. So you can see that this particular part of your assessment instruction, not only it serves as an instruction for students to be able to perform the task, okay, to your standard so that students can actually score according to your marking scheme or rubric. It is also act to support your student in going through the process, because we are talking about alternative assessment is indeed a process type of assessment. Okay, so after that, you need to give students some idea on how long they should spend on that particular assessment. And also, obviously, you need to provide your rubric so that student will be able to use it as a guide and to strategize how they're going to score. So that is what alternative assessment instructions roughly supposed to be. Minimum requirement, I would say, right? So I would like to stop at that point first, in case there's any question before I share with you how we can move on and design other alternative assessment using other variables. Because at the moment we are now, we are only considering one or two variables so far. Puan Iza, is there any question in the chat box?
There is a question in the chat. I don't know whether you want to address it now or maybe towards the end, because we had a similar question during the first session, which I thought would be best sort of shared here, and that's to do with the integrity of alternative assessment, where alternative assessments is ideal to do in terms of authenticity, but sometimes it's very difficult to prove or justify the use of alternative assessment, especially in terms of making sure of its integrity. And the second layer question to that by Ms. Lena from UCSI is also asking about how do we ensure that integrity is maintained by our students. So I think it goes back to your initial sort of trust and mistrust issue. And the other questions as well, maybe you can address that one while I organize and manage the other questions for you.
Right, thank you, Ms. Iza, and thank you to those questions. When we talk about alternative assessment, I'm not saying that student won't cheat, because when we talk, for example, I give you a typical example where student actually cheat and also copy all the time. For example, when we give student lab work, or when we give students to even an assignment like this, they can copy their seniors' work. I remember that I received a lab work report with students forgotten to actually put their names in. It's still their senior's name and year, and they submit as theirs, right? You can get that in alternative assessment, of course, but there are, as I mentioned, there are ways on how we can deal with that, and hopefully we can reduce and we can address the integrity issues there. So with that, I would like to introduce you to other parameters.
Sorry, Dr. Aishah, before you proceed, there are a couple more questions. I think maybe it's good for us to address it now. So there are a question by Ms. Hasna, who is asking whether, I think this has something to do more with our program and standard program requirement and program standards, whether we can replace final examination with alternative assessment.
Right, I will answer that immediately. Whether you can replace examination with alternative assessment, that is an institutional decision. Yes. So MQA allows institution to decide. And in fact, I think the recent MQA a letter that we received, they have actually advised institution to give a little bit more autonomy to the lecturers to decide what best and how best to measure student learning outcome. Correct. So you need to deal with your institution.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of a belief that it is a requirement to have final examination for all the courses, and I think it's not an MQA issue. I think it's more of how we design assessment. The other question is also about with regards to formative assessment, whilst it's really good to have formative assessment to make sure that everything's on track and the students are, there's an issue with a lot of students who are not quite responsive. When it's not graded, the students don't respond. So this is a question again from Norlina, how do we encourage students to participate in alternative assessment?
I do agree that when it's not graded, then they don't respond. What I did, I normally give them a schedule that they can put in their appointment for me to give them feedback on their alternative assessment. But recently, because it is online, I had the same experience where I did not get all groups participated in formative assessment. I had only 2 groups willing to participate. And when I asked them what happened to other groups, and they said because during the teleconferencing, when I gave 1 or 2 groups feedback, they request me to record the session, and they said other groups would like to learn from these 2 groups that I've recorded. They do not themselves wanting to participate in the formative assessment and in the feedback session because they have not done anything yet. So those are realities. We can actually try and take measures, but I am okay with whatever my students' decisions are, as long as learning occurs, actually.
At this point, I also like to encourage other members, if you also have your point of view that you'd like to share with the other participants, please do drop it in the comment section. One last question before we move on, Dr. Aishah, which is a question that I'm quite interested to ask myself. In fact, it's one of the questions that I was hoping to ask you during this session. Is you mentioned about designing group assessment, and one of the issues about designing or giving a group assessment or collaborative work is that how do we ensure every participant within the group is involved in the task, and secondly, how do we sort of ensure that reflects in sort of the attainment of learning outcome for each individual student? This question was shared by Kavita from us, from Sunway University.
Thank you. I think I got this question again and again in quite a number of webinars, and I love to share the technique that I use, which is very, very effective indeed. And this is actually shown in the later in my later slides, but I think I would like to address that straight away. You see, if we this is one of the alternative assessment that I've practiced before, and I love problem-based learning as an alternative assessment. As I mentioned, the underlying theory behind it is the ZPD, as I mentioned just now. And also you can see that the main feature of PBL is actually is actually not only to help students in their ability to link content to the problems that they are trying to solve, but also to help students to develop their interaction, to develop their positive interdependency, to develop individual accountability, appropriate use of interpersonal skill, and also to help students to regularly self-check their group function. So to answer to your question is that how can we get students not being a rider to a certain extent? Am I correct, Iza?
I think that's exactly what it's been now.
Or a sleeping partner.
A sleeping partner.
Yeah. If, for example, your course is responsible to measure teamwork, to measure, for example, values, ethics. So this is the best point for you to really test it. to really have a look at whether positive interdependency is actually occurring in that group. So what I did normally is that not only I have a rubric, during I cannot expect them to be able to develop this positive interdependency in a group work. As I mentioned to you, when we talk about alternative assessment, we are talking about developing trust, developing graduate attributes, right? So we need to help students to develop this positive interdependency so that they will not be one of these sleeping partners. So how can we do that? So what I normally do is, as I mentioned, I will give every group a slot for them to have a session with me as a formative assessment. So during that feedback session, you can see I actually simulate the actual assessment. So when I talk about the actual assessment, I'm talking about evaluation. So what I did, except that this feedback session is much longer than the actual final assessment. The actual final assessment is actually group interview. So in this particular PBL session, what I told my student is that you will be getting your marks from the group interview, 10%. You will, out of that, actually, although it is a group interview, that 10 marks is actually individual mark, except that they sit for that exam in a form of group interview in a group. So this requires a little bit of practice actually. So when I use this technique, I put them in a group, interviewed them in a group. And the other form of assessment for this particular PBL work was the group report. So you can see that the marks are actually coming in from the report and also from the group interview. 10% here and 10% here. This is group mark, and this is individual mark. Although they being interviewed in a group, but their marks is actually individual. So the fact that their marks is individual, they are very, very worried, and they really have to look after themselves. So how do I eliminate those sleeping partners? So during the mock interview, so I had a mock interview session with them, I checked their interdependency. So how do I check their interdependency? So first of all, obviously in this particular problem-based learning, I have measures on how I get them to work. So I actually use a fill-out form here. And during the group interview, I actually asked them to show me their fill-out form. And I asked them who in the group is actually in charge of that fill-out form. And I asked them who is taking what role in that group, and I checked their role against their group contract. So at the beginning, they have to sign their group contract, and they have to determine what role do I play in this group and what is it that I'm going to contribute in that group. So during this mock interview, I check their roles, see whether they are actually playing their role or not. And I actually make them aware the impact of them not playing their role to the project to the problem that they are currently trying to solve. So the kind of questions that I give to my students, I don't normally use a belated type of thing. I normally use questions because questions make them think. I normally ask them, okay, now that you can see in this picture, I actually get them to put their fill-out form across, and then I ask them, okay, if we are talking of 1 to 10 scale, can you tell me, your group should get what grade to now? So normally students will give themselves quite a fairly higher marks. But later on, when I actually show them how they made a mistake in filling in the fill-out form, how they make a mistake in linking the subject content to the problems that they are trying to solve, how some of them are not playing their roles, they're beginning to realize, that I'm not achieving the skill that I initially put to myself. And also I normally make them realize that if one of them are not contributing according to the time as what has been mentioned in the form, because you can see the form that I use is an adapted filler form. It is not a full a normal filler form. I made a little bit of changes there. You can see that there is a requirement for students to put their names on who's supposed to be in charge of what and by what date. So I normally check, for example, here, this is where students feel to a certain extent afraid and start to be accountable and start to wake up from their sleep. Because in class, I told them that if Zaitun is supposed to find that information, for example, here, Zaitun has been assigned to find what happened in that event from the trigger that they work on. I told them I'm not going to ask Zaitun what has she found when she was trying to find information based on the questions that they came up with. But during the interview, I told them that I will ask other group members to tell me what Zaitun has found. So because of that, students really change. After the mock interview, normally they change more than 360 degrees in terms of their attitude, in terms of their interest, in terms of their ability to think critically, and how they work on that particular assessment. So in here, students are aware that if Zaitun found that information, not only I will ask, for example, Zaul, normally during the mock interview, I will say, okay, since Zaitun have to find this information, can I find out what Zaitun have found, Zaul? So Zaul will have to respond. And here you can see that her name is Zairine, not Zaitun. Zairine has no chance but to make sure whatever that she found need to be communicated to the rest of the group, because they don't know during the interview who is going to be assigned to explain what she have found. And not only she have to explain to the rest of the group, she also need to make sure that the rest of the group also need to have that information, or the source of information, be it journal paper, be it from the newspaper cutting, or be it from whatever report or standard it is. So I found this technique very effective because I've done this many years and many times. And because of that, quite a lot of them being employed by quite a very renowned company just because they have gone through this process actually. So they are aware and they know that they have to work in a group, and they cannot be doing it separately. And this interdependency as well, because it's so powerful. If you develop it in your alternative assessment, you will find that your students will be able to come up with a cohesive report rather than disjointed and disintegrated parts where one person is actually writing one part, the other person is writing one part. So I do hope that with that lengthy explanation, it helps you to see.
It really does, and I think it's kind of important to highlight that interdependency sort of activities or tasks that you've sort of explained is quite different from peer evaluation. So maybe just a short sort of input on what you think about peer evaluation in such circumstances, whether that works well or something that we should totally avoid because it involves individual students grading their peers. I mean, from your experience, has that worked?
Yes, it has worked many times. Every semester that I use my PBL that way, and it really worked.
Right. Okay. So because sometimes students fall under pressure for peer evaluation, so they're fearful, so they still grade their peers high even though they didn't do the work. So so I think that those are the things that we like through the what you have mentioned about interview, making sure everybody knows what everybody is doing. I think that's one way to sort of prevent that. Let's move on, and I will try to address as more questions for, but I think because there's one more question about group, and that's about group selection and how do you ensure that you get a good balance of composition of varying capabilities among students, or instead of students wanting to stick with their friends and same peer.
I would like to address how can we help students in terms of group selection, because there are so many guides that you can refer out there. But the one that I normally use is that I will brief students on how you can actually form a group. But because this is only a 10% assignment, I do not actually give them link or guide on how they should choose their group. But for a bigger alternative assessment, like the PBL that I used, that I demonstrate just now, I actually give them guides on how should you form your group. So before, to be honest, before I give them guides, I actually put them in an activity. So what kind of activity did I put them? I put them in an activity called record team. I'm sure you must have come across this before, rec team. Right. So record team is an activity that I give my students. In fact, normally after they have formed a group, but before they form a group, I normally give them several guides. They can choose their team members from the same ethnic background. I give them an implication what happens if you choose from the same ethnic background, depending on, again, the task that you give your students. If the task that you give to your students requires them to work in interdisciplinary, or if it's not just a subject discipline, it is an integration of quite a number of things, then I think the best guide that you can give to your student is that it is not good for them to choose team members from the same ethnic background because of this and this. I normally tell them that they are not also advised to be in a single, what we call single gender. It would be best to have a mix background, but when they have a mixed background, the things that they also need to think about is their schedule, make sure that they have a common schedule. And another thing is they have to make sure that they agreed on the communication platform. They also have to agree on where to meet. So the place where they stay play a very important factor in the group forming decision as well. So I normally give them several parameters for them to think before they choose their team members. Because at the end of the day, after they have chosen their team members, I will then ask them to sit in their group, and I normally ask them to do a little bit of what we call an introduction among themselves. And normally if it's normally I do this if the whole course is a project based, or if the whole course is a problem oriented project based type of a course. So what happened is that after they have chosen the group, I normally put them in a group and I ask the group to introduce themselves. But I don't normally get them to introduce like a normal way. I give them each person 3 sticky notes, okay? And each of them need to actually write their strengths and their weaknesses. So when they introduce themselves, they have to say that, okay, my name is so and so, my strength is this, and my weaknesses is this. And the reason why I carry out that activity is to allow their team members to know who in my team is suited for what role in that team. Because we are talking about they have to work in a team for quite a long time if we are talking about alternative assessment with a very long time frame. So they have to know each team member's strengths and weaknesses, because they need to find out who suits to be the facilitator, who suits to be the batu api. Batu api here meaning that the person who keep challenging ideas when whoever team members actually come up with ideas. We need that kind of person in a team. We cannot be having a team members that everybody agree in everything. That is not healthy. That is not good. So after they have actually introduced themselves using that activity, then only I ask them to go on and play the rec team game. So in this game, what they need to do is they need to list each of them again. I give them a sticky note. They have to list 3 things that can wreck their team. For example, one of them said that I think being dominant will wreck this team, or being too quiet, not participating at all is gonna be, you know, disaster to this particular team. So after they have written that 3 main thing that they think that can wreck a team, then only I ask them to do thematic analysis. So they need to find out what are the common agreed main points that will wreck their team, and that will be put into their group contract. So they have, after this activity, I ask them to fill in the group contract. So what consists the group contract is their names, their group names, the roles that each of them will actually play in that group, and their responsibility, their accountability that they have to agreed upon in terms of meetings, in terms of communication, in terms of respect each other, in terms of accountability, and they must also put the 3 points that their team recognize that the team will be wrecked, so that if it's happened, the one who wrecked the team will have to be punished. And as a lecturer, I use their contract whenever conflict arise, so that the decision is not, the punishment or whatever it is not made by me. It is made by the team from all these activities that I've created for them early on. So that is roughly how we help students to develop a strong teamwork at the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Aishah, for a very detailed explanation. I think that's very important. I mean, I think too often we just put students into group and expect them to work well together without having any form of induction. With any good teamwork, you need some sort of induction, and getting to know each other in the ice-breaking session is just as important. So I hope that answers your question, Mr. Adnan Hassan. And I think Nolina from UCS, I also sort of agreed with you, as she uses a technique where she gives a specific guidelines in terms of how to sort of build the composition of the team. So I think I'll let you get back to the variables, and hopefully we've got, just to let you know, we've got about 30 minutes, and I'm sure you want another session of Q&A with the participants before the end of your session. So maybe just to let you know, maybe you have another sort of 20 to 25 minutes to sort of round up your session. All right.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again. All right. I think we are ready to explore at least a few more variables that we can use to design our alternative assessment. The one that I also like to introduce to you, that I use often in designing my alternative assessment, is variable number 5, degree of authenticity. And also variable number 9, student choice, and also student's voice. And in here, the authenticity, the degree of authenticity that I give to my student is that I get my students to choose real engineering application of their choice in this particular task. I did not actually dictate that all of you need to write a report on this particular engineering application. No. So because student can choose and find out whatever engineering application of their interest, so that actually helps student not only to be interested in performing the task that we give them, but it also create what we call an authenticity. And I also tell my student that each group cannot have the same engineering technology application that they would like to submit, right? And also, I also give students choice. Not only here that they have to make sure that they find a real application. Here, I actually give them choice. What I mean by giving choice is that in this particular subject, there are 3 types of rod. So I told my students that you choose what type of rod that you would like to consider in this particular assignment. So I did not dictate that, okay, group 1, this rock and this application, group 2, this rock and this application, but they themselves have to make decision, and each group cannot actually have the same combination of variable number 5 and also variable number 9. So let's have a look at the end of the day. When it comes to variable number 9, we can see that there are ways on how we can use variable number 9 and also variable number 5. So what I would like to further share with you is how we can make use of variable number 5 and also variable number 9. Okay. So here is variable number 5. We can see that normally in exam, it is very difficult for us to come up with an assessment question or come up with an assessment instruction that is contextualized or authentic in nature. Most of our questions sometimes are very decontextualized, meaning that we give students some calculation to do or we give them some report to write, but it is not of real application, does not actually require students to connect with the real problems or to the real thing that they're going to do when they work, or to for example, to their personal experience, or also how that subject content or subject matter have an impact to others. So you can see that when creating our alternative assessment, we can now use the 4 ways to create authenticity. One is embedding context. So what do we mean by embedding context? So when we create a task for students to perform, we can actually ask students to either assume a particular role. Let's say, for example, like in my case, because my student will eventually become an engineer, then I normally tell my student, as an engineer, you will have to do this, this, and this. For example, even a lab work, we know all this while lab work is indeed an alternative assessment. So how can we improve the instruction of our lab work? Not necessarily all the time student will have to submit their lab report, the typical lab report that majority of us are familiar with. We can actually get our student to write a lab report. For example, we can phrase the task such that we can ask student to perform the lab and prepare the lab report as them being the expert of that lab processes and wanting to share the lab work and the lab results to the public. For example, like now we are talking about the vaccines and everything, right? We can see that many experts are now trying to tell the public about the vaccine in a layman's term. So by right now, we should be getting our student to do that as well. So we shouldn't be getting our student to typically, submit a lab report that we so used to. So bringing in context can create a much better authenticity when we design our alternative assessment. Secondly, how can we get our students to perform a task better or bring in authenticity to our alternative assessment is to get our students to really look into real world processes, or using the tools and using the standards. So I think this is also something that we are familiar with, but when students are actually given a real world processes, this is when I think the support from the lecturer, and especially I don't think I can emphasize this even more, we have to help students to develop ability to link subject content to the real world processes, to the quality standards, to the tools or to the tasks that they are performing. Because I'm sure we have come across where students, when you put them into real world processes or even in the lab where they are actually using the tools or actually making use of the quality standards or operation manual, they are like robot. They are just performing it like a cookbook kind of task. We that if we put our students into that kind of alternative assessment, we fail to get the benefit of why we use and why we choose alternative assessment in the first place. We choose and we use alternative in the first place, as I mentioned, if trust is building trust and building graduate attribute, desired graduate attribute is our main aim. We need to work on the support. So if students perform lab work, for example, so how do we support students performing lab work? Because in their real world of work, perhaps they have to perform that particular lab work. Then during that lab work, what we need to do, obviously we need to ask them questions. We need to plan how can we ask structured questions so that thinking and linking subject content to what they are doing can be realized during that session. So I normally do this by asking them questions while they are doing their lab work. I ask structured questions until they realize, oh, this is the part that I learned in the lecture last week. So I think that is very important indeed when talking about creating authenticity in alternative assessment. And another thing about creating authenticity in alternative assessment is we can actually get students to think of what is it that they do in that task that will have an impact to others. So this will require students to really think deep, to do critical reflection. Similarly, with number 4, personal authenticity, this will require students to critically think and also do reflection, because they need to relate the subject content to whatever their experience and whatever others have experienced. So these variable number 5 and how we can make use of variable number 5, degree of authenticity, in designing our alternative assessment, so that students won't be able to cheat, to copy, because when we talk about, especially in personal authenticity, I'll give you an example of how I experience personal authenticity and why I also make use of personal authenticity in my alternative assessment. When I was in Manchester, I attended the staff training program, and I remember I enrolled for learning theories session. And that session only lasts for 2 hours, but before you were allowed to join the face-to-face 2-hour session, you have been given all the materials for you to read, for you to listen, journal paper for you to digest. And also you have been given a pre-session worksheet. In that pre-session worksheet, what I noticed is that every participants were given the same pre-session worksheet, and it only contains 3 simple questions. The questions there was, how do you use this, which theory do you use in which subject have you thought? You know, in that in that training program, we have to learn at least 5 or more than 5 learning theories. Like the ZPD is one of the learning theories, the one that I shared with you earlier on. And you can see that although all the participants get the same question, none of our answer will be the same. And I realized that I cannot copy my colleagues' answer before I attend the face-to-face session, because the question is so personal, or because the question comes with personal authenticity. It's about you. It's about which learning theories do you use in your subject. So you can see how powerful it is that you can avoid students from copying, from cheating each other, but obviously participants can actually discuss. And in fact, that is exactly what we were asked to do during the face-to-face session. Everybody have to tell other people what are the learning theories that you use in your class and how you use it. So I hope that to a certain extent address the earlier question on how do we ensure integrity in alternative assessment. So one of the way on how do we ensure integrity so that students does not actually cheat or copying or do things that we don't want them to do, is to create a good degree of authenticity in your alternative assessment. And another, I do hope that you can have a look at this degree of authenticity. These are just examples. And another parameters that I would like to share with you is parameter number 8, and it is not parameter number 9. And this will also help to ensure integrity in alternative assessment, is by creating what we call students' voice and also choice. So when designing your alternative assessment, you can design it in such a way that you give students choice and also voice. The one that I used before, that I shared with you earlier on for my assignment 1, is actually number 3. I asked students to submit the same product. So when I talk about same product, I asked students to submit a report. But in their report, each of the report will have different focus, because I asked my student to choose. First, I asked them to choose which engineering application you would like to talk about in your report. Second, I get my students to choose what type of rock do you like to discuss in your report. So all in all, if you look at the combination, I have good enough combination for all the 10 groups, so that they are different. So each product will be different from one another. So you can play around with this, at least these 2 variables to ensure integrity in alternative assessment. I do hope that I to a certain extent address that question. Right. So this is just another example of how we can design an alternative assessment. Obviously, this is a short alternative assessment. We are talking about like a lesson, or maybe 1 or 2 lesson time frame of alternative assessment. You can see here, this is an example of maths, where we normally get students to plot 2 functions of graphs, and we get students to identify the intercepts of x and y. But that is, if we just ask students to get the intercept of x and y, I would say that as a student, what does it mean to me, right? How do I use it in everyday life, this particular knowledge? So it would be actually best for us to bring in context and also bring in student choice and voice here, to let students see how that piece of knowledge can be used in their everyday life. So you can see we can create several scenarios, and these are just example of the scenarios. You can see that scenario 1 is actually meant for these two functions, and that particular knowledge to be used for a business that aim for a much better outcome. And similarly, scenario number 2, this is actually putting in a context where you can use that piece of knowledge to help a hungry university student to take care of your wallet, and also for a football team. So you can get students to choose which scenarios, or they can come up with their own scenarios if they like, in making use of that piece of subject content, right? So those are basically several of the parameters that I would like to share with you in this session. But as I mentioned earlier on, it is incomplete if I talk about alternative assessment without going through with you how we can support students and develop students' graduate attribute throughout the process. Because as I mentioned again and again, alternative assessment is about assessing process and also apart from assessing product. So most of the time we are using feedback as means to support our students, but we can also, as I mentioned earlier on, apart from giving student feedback, we can use other things to support our student. We can use lecture to support student. We can get students to actually do, we can create a mini activity like a debate to support their main project. The main project is actually at the center. We can get students to work collaboratively to support the task that they need to do in their project. So you can see if you choose a particular alternative assessment, I do hope that you realize that you also need to at least think of 3 support system that you can deliver over your alternative assessment period of time. So this is an example of integrated design that normally delivered for 14 weeks, and the whole subject is delivered through a project-based learning. And you can see how we decided that these 3 main items will really help students to perform the project to our intended outcome at the end of the day. And you can see after we have designed our alternative assessment like so, we are ready to actually put them in a teaching plan like so. And we also need to find out when we will check on students' progress and at what point we're going to grade them. And we also need to decide not only at what point we need to grade them, we also need to decide on whether the grades are going to be group or individual. Normally in a course, obviously you have some of your evaluation will be group mark, some of your evaluation will be individual, right? So you can see this is the assessment instructions. As I mentioned to you, the format is roughly like this, and you will have to tell your students where the marks gonna be and what are the rubrics. So before I end, I just like to share with you, there are so many alternative assessment that you can choose from. You can either use studio-based learning, experiential learning, scenario-based, project-based, game-based, case-based, challenge-based. and many others out there. I have used challenge-based before. I really love use challenge-based. I experimented this twice. And I got international student from China when I asked them to try and come up with a faculty of engineering with a garden concept. My student from mainland China have actually proposed for the garden not to be the normal biological garden, but electronic garden. So you can imagine how that push students' imagination to the limit. So with that electronic garden, you can see how students able to think how they can make use of technology together with the concept that they're supposed to embrace. So I have actually I've given you this PowerPoint so you can have a read and try to think of why do you want to use studio base and all this, because for your information, each of them have different learning theories behind it. So when we talk about learning theories, why do I mention about learning theories? Because the learning theories will guide you on what is it that you need to focus. What is it that you want to develop with that alternative assessment that you choose. For example, when we talk about studio-based, here the main characteristic of studio-based is that they will have to learn with the mentor and they will have to go through crits. Okay, so you can see that here we are talking about the theories or the underpinning theories is learning from the pro. It's not them experiencing and reflecting and all that. No. If you really want students to do deep reflection is the main thing that you would like students to really go for, then this will be suitable for you, right? So the choice is very much depends on what is the underpinning theory behind all this. And these are some of the delivery modes that you can think of or you can use when you want to put those around it. So these are the teaching approaches, and these are all the delivery modes. The one in purple that you can choose from all these purple cards. So I'm not going to explain to you there. So basically, that is roughly what this session is all about. But before I end, I think there are so many of us who have gone through critical reflection. All I'm saying is that, before I end as well, the one that I shared with you earlier on, how do I check interdependency, this and that, although the one that I described to you is the one that I've done it before the pandemic, therefore it was done face-to-face. Maybe some of you said, okay, in now the fact that I am in the remote online environment, can I still use it? The answer is yes. So which feature of Moodle can you use to allow feedback to occur, to allow peer learning to occur? You can see there are features such as the one that I really would like you, is it not here? There's a workshop feature apart from forum. Apart from there is one feature called workshop. I think in Moodle that allow you to set up and you can get your students to give peer feedback. So please remember, feedback is a very powerful tool in alternative assessment. And in fact, alternative assessment is not alternative assessment if students do not receive feedback. Therefore, you can set up in Moodle, because most of us are actually using Moodle as our LMS. Workshop allow you to set up peer feedback and they can learn from each other. So when you set up peer feedback in workshop, make sure that you put up the what we call the rubric, so that the feedback will be based on the rubric that they need to improve. Finally, I just like to share with you how we should help our students to do critical reflection. A lot of us perhaps ask our student at the end of our alternative assessment to reflect, to find out whether they have learned something from the alternative assessment. But many of us ask students reflect lah, just to reflect. For your information, if we want to do critical reflection, we need to adopt at least a good model to reflect. And one of the model that simple enough for me to explain is a COPES model. And in the COPES model, after you ask your student to go through the problem-based or case-based or whatever it is, perhaps you would like your students to find out what have they experienced, and then write it down what they have experienced, and then link their experience to how much they have developed in terms of knowledge, in terms of their skills, in terms of their practical skills, in terms of their attitude, and then find out from them what is their commitment from what they have realized to further improve themselves. So that using these scope cycles, this will ensure that whatever that student have reflect will actually turn into action. Reflection is no good if you only think about it without it being without it being transformed into action. Ilmu tu mesti pergi kepada amal. So you can see how we can actually help students to reflect. For example, this is one of the subjects that really requires students to reflect deeply, because it's about community engagement. So here you can see that we guide students on how to reflect, and we guide students on what to write when they actually do their reflection. So these are some of the guiding questions that being used for students to do their reflection. So they have to reflect, and here we can ask them to use all 4 or only in this case 2 of the areas that have an impact to their development, right? So that is all for the 2-hour session. I do hope that we benefit from the session, and I like to open the session to question and answer. I'd like to pass it back to Iza.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Aishah. It's really interesting. I'm so fascinated because I take a real interest in this subject. Being a QA person at the university, these are some of the issues and questions that I also get. So I'll open up. I mean, I'll leave my question. I think I'll give the opportunity for the participants to probably ask a few more questions. We can spend hopefully another 10 minutes if the participants do not mind. I know it's 4 o'clock already, but I think because it's such an interesting topic, I don't think anyone would mind to spend a few more minutes, getting your questions off your chest, I suppose. So can I invite the participants? If you'd like to speak to Dr. Aishah directly, you can turn on your video and speak to her. I think she'd like to see somebody from the participant group, and if you rather put it in the chat, you're welcome to do so as well. I do have a question while others probably will gather their thoughts and try to digest the information that Dr. Aishah gave. One of the questions is coming again from Nolina from UCSI, who's asking whether, designing standardized assessment, how we can design a standardized assessment and still keep its integrity. I think probably integrity meaning more on authenticity rather, I think, how to, design a standardized assessment and still, have authenticity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I think I mentioned during the presentation that you can still use at least some of those variables out of 12 variables for you to design your exam question. So I have actually tried and used it twice so far. in the midterm exam, and I've collected data, and my data was very promising, and I found that none of my students actually cheat or copy each other's questions because the question is so authentic in nature. And not only I use a variable, authenticity variable, I also use two variables that I embed in my exam question. One is authenticity and another one is actually student choice and voice. So how do I do it? Right. What happened is that I normally have a question like describe so and so. So how do I embed authenticity in that exam question? I said, as a junior technologist, you are supposed to describe this, and this. So you can see the first part of the question that I now rephrase is where I embed context in that question. And at the end of the question, what I did was I actually said to my student, your description should be at this particular at one of this particular locality. So I give them several choice of locality where they have to describe the thing that I want them to describe. So because of that, my students do not have the chance to copy each other because they don't know who actually choose which locality. And also they have to take time to write that description on the context that I've created in that question. So that is how I use the variables that I shared with you just now to rephrase my exam question into an authentic exam question to ensure integrity in the exam.
Thank you so much, Narina, for your question. It's a good question. I have Lee Zilin video is on. Would you like to ask a question directly to Dr. Aishah? I think she's frozen. It's okay. If you're having trouble with the connection, you can post your question in the chat, or we can get back to you if you have time. Another question from Miss Irene Chang, who's asking about how to conduct lab or internship, especially during this pandemic, where lack of sort of face-to-face classes are being conducted. So, and how do you assess those, internship and lab work?
I would like to address on the lab work first. I think currently with the MQA advice, I think lab work can be postponed until today, until students can actually get back to, if it's a standardized lab work, then you have no choice but to use the actual equipment for that standardized lab work. However, if your institution allows you to simulate the lab work, you can come up with a simulation of that lab work that's still allowing students to achieve the learning outcome, right? At the moment, I am coming up with a technique on how do I convert my lab work into a mini, how do I say it? A mini kit that I can send to my student, okay? And they can do what they normally have to do it in the lab, but using that small portable safe kit in their own room. At the moment, I cannot reveal that yet because it has not been launched. But it's all ready. I do hope that I can share in near future. Yes, you can. So what I did in that project was I converted my normal lab, the one that normally students use as standardized equipment, into a very small kit that I am able to send it via, I can sell it through Lazada, wherever it is. A student can buy that kit and can use that kit to conduct their lab work at home, safe enough. and they can still actually achieve their learning outcome.
Thank you, Dr. Aishah. I have a reminder from Ms. Lillian from MQA, who's just shared with us the MQA advisory note. So this is more applicable to our colleagues locally who are subjected to MQA requirement, not so much for our international colleagues, but yes, so that there is a sort of an advisory note in terms of how we would want to approach delivery and assessment during this lockdown period. So thank you so much, Mr. Lim, for sharing that and reminding us again. There is a lot of flexibility. Yeah.
Can I just share another technique that I think
sure.
worth sharing? My colleagues give me this idea, you know, for example, you normally during the internship, you send your student out on the field, right? Or let's say you are actually teaching a subject where it really requires your student to be out and about. And during the pandemic and during the lockdown, you are not allowed to go out. So how can you go out virtually? You can. There's such thing as Google Map and Google Earth. Right. So what she did was she actually get her student to go out using Google Earth. And it was really successful. And I adapted her idea in my midterm test the other day, where I actually get my students to go out because my my question was about they have to describe the soil. So instead of me giving them the soil to describe, or instead of them having to go to the lab, so I asked them to go out using Google Earth to their hometown. So regardless where they are, they can actually go to their hometown and have a look at, from the Google Earth, have a look at any outcrops that shows the soil there. And they can also use, for example, the geological Google map from the Jabatan Minerals and Science to find out what are the rocks underneath, therefore what are the soils form in their hometown. So there are plenty of ways actually that we can do this, and that is so authentic in nature, so real. So do not think that space limit us, be it in a physical space or in a virtual space. We should allow ourselves to move freely and do what we have done before. Before the pandemic.
Yeah, I think we're limited by our own innovative and creativity. I think you know, I think we need to explore, and this is such a good time. I always say that the pandemic brings along with it a silver lining, a hikmah, you know, that people, you know, start being more creative with their teaching and learning. And I've certainly seen that in our institution. And just to go back to Ms. Lillian's a reminder about the MQ advisory. I mean, certainly MQ has been very flexible in terms of how we want to do assessment and ensure and still ensure the attainment of learning outcome. And one of the ways that I think one of the interesting that we found out about internship was, you know, as we couldn't go out at the time, was a lockdown, and we started doing problem solving projects with a company, but having a real life industry sort of supervisor beyond that project with the student, and the student was saying that they had more engagement with in comparison to when they actually do the internship, and they was more targeted to the kind of skills that they need to have, even so that they're not, you know, using their psychomotor skills to do some of these things, which you rarely use when you go into companies, but really using really good thought processes and critical thinking in terms of solving real company issues and problems.
And another thing is, I think we need to realize that World Bank has predicted that, and in fact, data that came in actually suggested that most of our graduate in future, like 30% of them, these are actually data from Talent Corp, that most of our graduates will be freelancing, will be doing freelancing and all that. So if we think about that, why should we stick to the normal internship manner when we know that you know, physical the physical building for us to place them is not really the main thing now. So we need to explore and as you mentioned, the hikmah of being working in a distance manner.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yes. Oh, there's always good that comes
yeah.
from that. Thank you, Dr. Aishah. I think I've got one more question. I think I'll wrap it up unless Lee Zealand, you want to try again and ask your question. This is one from Kavita who says that her experience from
Telah dibuat.
hello. We've got some. Chair Nolia, did you want to ask a question? Okay, so I think she probably accidentally turned on her mic. So going back to the question from Ms. Gavita, who talks about sometimes she gets feedback because students, when they do things now that has authenticity and to do with a bit more projects and work that involves group work, especially, they tend to score higher and get feedback. We get feedback from moderators saying that is the assessment too easy or is it at an easy level? So she's wondering whether you have any comments towards that or any advice on how to approach moderators when they give such comments.
I like to thank Avita for raising this up. I mean, this is real. What happened is that in many institutions, especially during this last 2 semesters during the pandemic, we see the rise in good grades achieved by students. I'm not saying that these good grades are actually coming from the alternative assessment that lecturers have used. But my experience from practicing alternative assessment, if you really design it well and if you really design a good rubric, not all students or not majority of students will be able to score high. Because although I have given them feedback, not necessarily, especially if you look at alternative assessment that is short time frame in nature. So because it is a short time frame, we are talking like 2-3 weeks. So you can imagine there is a very low frequency that you can give student feedback. It is the feedback that allows students to improve. And another thing about feedback is that feedback is not a feedback if students do not actually take action from the feedback. And honestly, my experience tell me that only those group who respond to the feedback that actually score very well. But those who did not actually respond to the feedback, they still did not score as high as those who respond to the feedback correctly. So I do agree with Kavita. However, all I'm saying is that that is the main purpose of this topic and this webinar, and the reason why I designed this webinar that way, showing the how rather than the concept, is I hope to allow people to improve their practice, so that if we improve our practice, if we take care of that little details that I mentioned, how do we support the student, how do we give feedback, how do we actually develop teamwork and so on, interdependency and so on and so on. We do hope that by doing that, we will really develop student graduate attribute, which different students will perform differently. Obviously, different students will perform differently. And if you come up with a very good rubric and a very good observation and fair, itulah Izzah, to be honest, assessment is a very complex topic, very complex thing to practice, and even I myself keep on finding how I can improve it. Yeah, exploring and having to improve it because it is so complex in nature. So we really need to improve ourselves again and again, and I don't think we will never we will stop at finding what is the best way to deal with this. So if all I'm saying is that not only in Malaysia, this is not the case only for Malaysia. Scholarship in assessment is not really something all I'm saying as established as scholarship of teaching and learning. And because of that, when pandemic hits, majority of us struggle with assessment. We are okay with delivery. We are okay with teaching online. However, when it comes to assessment, we really struggle because throughout the world, all this while, scholarship and assessment has not been given equal attention by the academics. So we do hope that this pandemic will create a good what we call a good call for scholarship of assessment.
Another silver lining.
Yes, and I do hope that by people now see the importance of taking care of assessment, because in quality assurance, one thing about quality assurance, you can escape from bad instruction, right? But you cannot escape from bad assessment. Assessment is the gatekeeper of quality assurance. So if you want to have a quality education, you have to take care of your assessment. Yeah. So I think that will be the closing remark from me about social assessment and how we ensure quality.
What a good way to sort of end the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Aishah. And I would just like to echo one of our participants, Dennis Legend, who just said that assertive assessment is not simple. It requires good planning, and I think we can all agree to that. Thank you again, Dr. Aishah. It has been so informative, and a lot of the things that you've shared, I've certainly is new to me. I think we need, like you said, we need to explore more further on this issue, and I hope sharing sessions like this will continue and we can all learn from each other. Before we end, I think there's a short video that our secretary would like to share, and before we close today's session, I'll let Xiao Yu take over and share.